I'm Rahul Tongia, and I'm joined by Samantha Gross, a scholar from Brookings in Washington, D.C. Samantha has had many roles in the private sector and government and is an expert on lots of issues on energy, geopolitics, sustainability. She was previously the head of the Office of International Climate Change and Clean Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, and as is visiting India, participated in a roundtable on November 13th at Brookings, India, on geopolitics and what's new for oil and gas. So Samantha, welcome to New Delhi.
Thanks for having me.
And I guess you're happy that it's rained.
It did.
The air
It cleared out
pollution.
the pollution considerably, so I'm not complaining.
Yes. So, other than the weather, I guess many people, like the stock market, look at oil prices. That seems to be another new trend and craze. And so, what's causing this sort of change? Is there anything happening? What are some trends in oil pricing and so forth? Is it just random volatility, or there's some more structural or longer term changes going on?
Well, I think in the short term today, the oil market is trying to figure out a couple different things. On the one hand, there's some uncertainty about economic growth going forward, and on the other hand, there's the impact of the Iran sanctions, the U.S. sanctions on Iran oil production. And so the market seems to be a little confused right now about which one it thinks is more important. And so you're seeing prices going up and down just right now based on whatever today's opinion is on which one of those is more important. But over the long term, the oil and gas market is well supplied. The world is swimming in oil and gas. But what we're seeing with respect to oil prices is that they respond to day-to-day events. So even if the world is well supplied over the long term, because oil exists in countries where they have a lot of political issues, because oil supply is lumpy, big projects tend to come online all at once. For all of these reasons, oil is a commodity that tends to have volatile prices, and so it's a tricky thing. Even though over the long term the market is well supplied, you still see volatility going on day to day and month to month.
You mentioned that the world is awash in oil and gas, and it's not all over the world. India, for example, is not rich in oil and gas resources. So a lot of the new reserves have come out of the United States, a lot of the growth, especially with tight oil and gas. Iran, you mentioned also, from an Indian perspective, that's of importance. Tell us a little bit about these two factors and how they impact the global oil market trends and things like this.
Well, as you've seen this U.S. administration pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, put sanctions back on Iranian oil production, that's really something that would have been really hard for the United States to do were it not for our rapidly expanding oil production. It would have been extremely painful for both the United States and for the world to reimpose those sanctions if it weren't for our own oil production. We're seeing rapid increases in U.S. oil and gas production, and so the million or so barrels that came off the market because of the Iran sanctions haven't been so harmful to prices.
Otherwise, they would have gone up.
Otherwise, I think they would have gone up much more than we've seen recently. And so that, in a sense, the increasing oil and gas production in the U.S. gave us the freedom to reimpose those sanctions. I'm not sure that was necessarily something we should have done, but at least gave us the ability to do so.
But from an Indian perspective, they still are seeking suppliers. And so the next question that many Indians worry about or wonder about is, these are relatively short-term tapering sorts of expectations that India should find other suppliers. Is that plausible, or is that then going to lead into higher prices? So is it just a matter of time, or how might that play out?
That's a really important question, and I think that will depend on how the U.S. administration continues to think. I mean, you saw right now that the U.S. administration gave 8 countries waivers from the sanctions, which is honestly more than I expected, based on the rhetoric that they were talking about earlier. But they didn't want to see oil prices go up before the U.S. midterm elections. And so it's going to kind of depend on the politics in the U.S., whether the price increases are something that we can deal with, or whether we feel more strongly about turning the screws on Iran. And so it's unfortunate for other countries, particularly India, that has a waiver right now, that it depends on U.S. politics what happens, but it does, whether
It's
this
interesting,
whether this administration is willing to deal with higher prices or not.
I mean, so India, of course, needs suppliers, and India is now setting up and receiving US gas. So tell me a little about gas, in the sense the US has historically used a lot of gas. India has actually seen its share fall from about 10-11% down to 6%, and now there are ambitions to grow it to 15%. So A, that's going to take a lot of gas. Where will it come from? It's not clear. It may be domestic in India. And B, how would it get consumed? Because there's also a pricing issue. So countries that use a lot of gas tend to have secure and or cheap supplies.
Yeah, and the U.S. definitely falls into that category, particularly with the shale gas and tight gas revolution. Natural gas prices in the U.S. are very low. You see natural gas outcompeting coal, something that's not going to happen in an Indian
And to
context.
clarify, it's outcompeting existing coal, meaning
Yes.
at the margin.
Yes, it
which is a
outcompeting-
very different scenario than it is in India, because here you're building new capacity from the coal, or all electricity is still in a growth phase.
Exactly. But something that might increase India's use of gas or make gas more attractive in the Indian market is you have to think about the advantages that gas has and whether or not the market is recognizing those advantages. For one thing, the way the Indian electricity market is set up, it doesn't really recognize the flexibility of gas and how many benefits that can bring, particularly as India works to grow the share of renewable energy in its portfolio. Gas makes a nice companion to that, to deal with intermittency and backup. Another aspect of gas that the Indian market isn't well set up to take advantage of is its lower carbon profile. If you say price carbon emissions, then you have gas being more competitive with coal because you're dealing with the additional externality of coal. I should say not many countries in the world do a good job at that, so that's not to give India a hard time, and the US hasn't done it. We've had so much gas displacement of coal just because gas is so cheap.
So obviously carbon, people recognize it, but they're not pricing it in explicitly, maybe implicit, a shadow price.
Yeah.
But maybe, is there value to gas enough from a local air pollution perspective? I mean, that's on everyone's topic seasonally.
Yeah, there
But-
certainly can be.
But there isn't enough gas to displace the humongous share that coal has. That would be a bridge too far, perhaps, for gas.
Yes, I think it likely would be, unless there's some sort of Indian gas resource we don't know about. However, in certain local areas where you have issues with local air pollution, gas displacement of other fuels can be really helpful, not just from a carbon perspective.
So then it's not coal only, but your enemies, so to speak, could even go to dirty other fuels,
Yeah,
petcoke or
exactly.
chemicals,
Or
for
diesel
petchem,
for
yeah,
bus transportation or those kinds of things.
need to
Absolutely.
be accelerated. Yeah.
Mhm.
So you mentioned carbon. A lot of the attention and discourse has come back after the IPCC report talking about the 1.5 degree sort of being a lost opportunity to keep it there. What is, I mean, it sounds very doom and gloom. And we're beyond the stage of sort of blame or India's responsibility. It's more about India's ability as opposed to responsibility. That's the right conversation. What are some insights or lessons of things that have been working? Because what does happen with the IPCC report is there's a lot more attention to this problem than ever before. There's a lot more, at least verbal recognition that we got to do something. Now, what is that something? How does it play out? What are you seeing? What are some positive steps or some lessons learned that maybe
Yeah.
if it...
I think an important thing that the recent IPCC report did is a lot of folks who really understand and are in the know about the energy system were starting to view the 1.5 degree C goal as kind of a lost cause. And the IPCC report really tried to draw out how important it is and how big of a difference there is between the 1.5 degree goal and the 2 degree goal. And so ideally that report will help us redouble our efforts to cut carbon. It's a difficult thing to do. It's difficult in many countries. It's particularly difficult in the States right now because we don't really have a federal level policy. And something that the US and India can share and think about together is subnational policies, state level policies. You see a lot of that in the States right now. It's a shame that we don't have a federal policy to sort of put a floor underneath what can be done. But on the other hand, there are some pretty serious state level efforts and private industry efforts. And so maybe the US and India could partner on how to work on those subnational efforts and how to take those, how to let those subnational efforts help you at the overall, at the level of the UN and the COP. Right now those don't really count, but on the other hand, they certainly count for the environment, and that's where a lot of the action is right now.
Absolutely. I mean, so subnational, often people mean governmental, but what about non-government? What about citizens, corporates? There's a lot of, again, press about these things, but how real is that, or how realistic is that?
I think it's very real. I think it's very difficult for corporate efforts or citizen efforts to get us all the way there, just because it's a long journey and we have a ways to go. But on the other hand, those efforts are really important. You see, particularly where I sit in Washington, you see a lot of corporate efforts for a number of reasons. Because large corporations who are planning on being around for a long time see the direction that the world is going. And it's also important for companies with reputations to make these efforts because their customers care. Their customers want to see them making these efforts. And so they do add up. But the one thing I will say is the thing that will really push low carbon solutions is when people can make money implementing those solutions.
So it's a no regrets option.
Yeah, money makes the world go round. And when it becomes a no regrets option, or an option where people can make money making those investments, that's when you won't be able to stop it.
But on one hand, we do hear, and to some extent it's true, cheap solar, cheap renewables. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons. It's certainly benefited from government support or policies worldwide. You had renewable portfolio or purchase obligations in much of the world, as well as other standards or performance norms and stuff. But at some point, the market is also flowing very rapidly towards that. But is that going to be enough? Is that just a matter of time, or are there more steps, policy actions, things missing in the conversation?
I think there are a number of things still missing. I mean, the move towards less expensive renewables is really important, but just to add a stack of different things, you have to be concerned about what you do when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. Batteries are
intermittency, storage. Yeah.
Yep, batteries are very expensive right now. Hydro makes a good partner. Gas makes a good partner while we wait and develop cheaper technology for storage and dealing with intermittency. And then we're talking about the power sector here with renewables, but if you really need deep decarbonization to get to a 1.5 degree type goal, you need to think about decarbonizing the transportation sector. You need to think about decarbonizing industry. There are places that are more difficult to decarbonize than the power sector. In some sense, that's the easy part, even though it's not exactly easy.
Sure, but the sort of good news may be that in India, heating is not a major requirement.
Yeah.
Electricity is a relatively higher share than in many other countries of the energy basket. And transportation is still relatively nascent in some ways, at least personal vehicular ownership and things like that. So there are some opportunities for India to go down a deeper decarbonizing path.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you look at India's emissions, India's per capita energy use is really quite low right now. I think the concern for the world is as India develops and becomes wealthier, what pathway they follow. And we would all be better off if India could follow a lower carbon pathway. But India certainly isn't creating the problem right now. It's more where India goes in the future.
Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.